All right, recording in progress, everything good. All right, first thing I want to do is welcome everybody here. This is our tail end of Records Management Month. So this is the last closing out ceremonies of Records Management Month in Virginia. And that was part of the whole point of this, was to kind of do something to celebrate Records Management Month. And we just kind of put it at the end, just kind of like tie everything off in a bow. Just for housekeeping sake, I wanted to tell everybody, everybody's coming in muted. We're asking everybody to stay muted, especially with this many people online. It just kind of gets really potential for chaos there. Mark and I will gladly take questions during the presentation. We ask that you put your questions in the chat, and our colleagues here that are helping co-host the meeting are going to be watching the chat and sing out and let us know that we have questions out there. Is there anything else housekeeping wise we need to deal with before we get started?
We'll ask everyone if they would just to turn off their video, because we're going to use a sort of a signal to Mark that if there is a question for him in there, then Tashana, one of our newest analysts, is going to turn her video on, and that will signal to him that there is a question on the line. So if everyone else could disable their video, then that would be great. And I'll start by doing that.
Well, I will go ahead and introduce my friend Mark here. Mark Myers, I've known Mark for 20 odd years now, and I have to say that most of what I've learned about electronic records, I have either learned alongside Mark or directly from him. So he's a great authority on electronic records archiving and electronic records management. Besides being a baseball fan, I know he's also a Krav Maga martial artist, so don't make him too mad. But we're really lucky to have Mark here today, and I will gladly turn it over to him. Go for it, my man.
Okay, let's see if I can do the screen sharing thing here. To tell you a little bit more about myself, this is kind of my adventures, where I've come from. As we were talking in the chat, I believe that Greg Crawford, who is now your all-state archivist, he and I went to grad school together at Auburn. So we started kind of down this path together. But I actually started as a student worker at the Alabama Department of Archives and History, which is the Alabama State Archives. In 1999, I was hired to be the electronic records archivist, which I find interesting because I think I was one of only two people that put the word computer on their application. The other guy turned it down. He's now the state archivist of Alabama, so yay. But I began doing electronic records management. At the time, late 90s, Alabama really didn't have the capacity to bring in electronic records. So I spent a lot of time doing electronic records management, retention scheduling, a lot of training in dealing with email management, website record keeping, all of that nature. In 2001, moved back to my home state of Kentucky, and was hired at the Kentucky State Archives to do largely the same thing. And Kentucky at that point had a small digital archive. Kentucky had been collecting electronic records, mostly minutes, publications, annual reports, that sort of thing, since the mid to late 90s. And they were trying to kind of build a more formal digital archive, and I was plugged into that. Again, did more electronic records management. In the mid 2000s, around 2008, 9, I kind of shifted gears a bit and started focusing specifically on the digital archive and doing more digital preservation at that point, which is kind of where I've been since then. In 2014, I was hired to come to the Texas State Archives, largely because of that photo. That is me with former Governor Rick Perry. We were on a flight together coming back. I think it was the 2009 or 2015. That's what the date says. Society of American Archivists meeting. I had gone to the SAA meeting. He was doing something else, but we flew back to Texas on the same flight. Basically, the Texas Digital Archive, which is what I manage, started with him. And in 2015, he had been governor of Texas from 2000 to 2015, and had decided to give his records to the state archives, which included approximately 7 terabytes of electronic records. Up until that time, the Texas State Archives hadn't taken in electronic records. More importantly, if you remember 2015, Governor Perry had run for president once before and was planning on running for president again. So we actually got an appropriation from the governor's office. We got money along with the records because they wanted to help us build a digital archive so his stuff could be put out there. And that's where the Texas Digital Archive, which is what I manage today, began. And as I said, we got about 7 terabytes of electronic records from the governor's office. Of that 7 terabytes, 3 terabytes were digital photographs. 3 terabytes was digital video files. 15 years of office files, which included probably 2 to 3 million files, was a little less than a terabyte. So text files are really small compared to digital media. Today, June will be my 10-year anniversary at Texas. Today, the Texas Digital Archive has about 200 terabytes of digital material, and we recently topped over 10 million documents in our digital repository. So, and over the years, I have also served on the electronic record section of Society of American Archivists. I've been president of our local ARMA chapter. I taught the digital appraisal digital records course for the Society of American Archivists for about the last 10, 15 years. I also taught records management, electronic records management course for a private company, Lorman Educational Services, years ago. So, like I said, I've been doing this for longer than I care to remember. So to get back to, let's see, yes. So we talk about digital and electronic records. This is kind of my bread and butter, but we've gone from paper records to electronic records in a very short amount of time, technically speaking. If you think about how record keeping technology has changed, we've gone from stone tablets to papyrus scrolls to books to where we are today. That process took thousands of years. Depending on who you really want to argue with, computer records started in the 40s and 50s. At that time, most computers were glorified calculators. If we get past the simple counting machines and started actually holding data or manipulating data in some way, shape, or form, that's really kind of the 50s, 60s. And then office computers really didn't start to become a big thing until more of the 70s. Personal computing, not until kind of the 80s. Now, there's overlap here. But really, the 60s. Essentially, is when computers started to become kind of common in the office place in some way, shape, or form. The internet, as we know it today, really didn't begin until the mid-90s. 1994 was when a company called Mosaic came out with the first graphical web browser. That was Netscape Navigator, the grandfather of Mozilla or Firefox. And it's really, while the internet existed before that, it was largely text-based. So it was in the mid-90s that you could start adding pictures to web pages. And even then, it wasn't until like 2000 that the Web 2.0 technologies really started to take off. Broadband internet became more of a thing. And that's when you could start putting up interactive websites. You could start dealing with audio and video on the web. So if you really think about it, the internet as we know it today, or the internet as my kids know it today, and my children are 19 and 20, it really didn't begin until around 2000. So in the grand scheme of things, electronic records are still relatively new, even though we've been dealing with them for 60, 70 years. So, but what we're largely creating, especially in government, are the same types of records in electronic format that we created in paper. What we've been doing is just changing formats, which also changes how we manage those records. The records and information is still the same. It's just how we use those records is what's changed. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about a little bit today. So I always want to start at the bottom. It's hard to judge people's experience with electronic records. I remember talking to a group of state records officers in Kentucky one time doing an hour-long presentation on email management, and I asked for questions at the end, and somebody raised their hand and said, "What did you mean when you said right-click?" So I always kind of like to start at a ground level. So what is a record? And let's start with that definition. And this definition comes from the International Standard for Record Keeping. I know Virginia, I am sure, has a definition of what is a public record or a state record or whatever the official government record is. And while the wording may be slightly different, it's probably going to contain the same basic concepts. So a record is something that is maintained. It's something that's captured. You're making an effort to keep it. That's what makes information different from records. Information's ephemeral. It's just kind of floating around out there. A record is when you take that information and you try to put it on something that you're going to keep for a certain amount of time. That time can be transitory or as long as you need it. That time could be permanent for what goes into the archives. And then you keep that, you're capturing that because you either have to by law or some type of rules, or you just need that record in the transaction of business. If you think about the records that you have at home, the records that you keep at home is, because you need those in some way, shape, or form. So that's the thing. Like the key is that you're making the effort to capture it. What is an electronic record? Again, it's a record that you're trying to retain in some way. It's all this information that has been captured or fixed in time. And you can argue how ephemeral that electronic storage media is or isn't, but you're still making that effort to try to pull that stuff out of the matrix, as it were, and make it real for a certain amount of time. And the other big aspect of this is that electronic records are what we refer to as machine readable. Paper records are eye readable. All you need to read them is to be able to look at them, and you can see the information that's on there. For an electronic record, and this includes audio video records too, you need some type of hardware and or software to be able to interpret those ones and zeros into something that we can understand. And we used to say electronic record was a record in a computer, but today records can exist in a wide variety of ways that don't even involve a computer anymore. But again, I go back to, and this is something I'm probably going to repeat over and over again, what makes that record valuable, what makes that record worth capturing is the same information that we've been capturing for a long time. This is on the left, you have an account ledger from the 1830s to 50s. And it's just capturing the date, what was sold, how much it was, whether or not that's been paid back or not. On the other side, you have, what comes out of accounting software. It's still the same information. Now, what electronic records give us is the ability to manipulate that information in new and interesting ways, but it's still the same information. So we think about the characteristics of electronic records, and these characteristics apply to paper records too, but they have some unique and interesting aspects for electronic records. And I will say that what I usually try to do in my presentations, people like for me to give them answers. They want to know what tools to use, what formats to use, what they should be doing. And I tell people all the time that, the answer to every question you ask me is going to start with, it depends, because it truly does. It truly depends on your situation, what resources that you have, what infrastructure you have, what IT support you have. So whether you have a cloud-based system or an in-house system or whatever is going to depend on a wide variety of factors. So what I usually try to do is present to you questions that you can take back to your stakeholders and say, these are the questions that we need to be asking. The specific answers to those questions is going to vary widely. What works for the Texas State Archives doesn't necessarily work for the Virginia State Archives, even though we're doing largely the same thing. What works for the state archives may not work for a local government because we have different resources. I remember sometime I was doing a university presentation and somebody said, "You work for the state archives, you have innumerable resources." And after I quit laughing for 15, 20 minutes, I said, the university probably has more resources than we do, simply because it's a different structure. So that's kind of the point of what I'm trying to do here. So these are the essential characteristics of most records. And again, digital preservation is kind of keeping all of this together. But electronic records have some unique aspects of this. The first one is this idea of authenticity or trust. If you read records management literature from the late 90s, early 2000s, it was all about trusting electronic records because business and especially the courts really didn't trust electronic information. If it was in paper, that was fine. If it was digital, it was like it could be corrupted. People could break into your system. People can forge and fake things. People could do that in paper too. It's just we're used to paper. And I think that was the big key. But an authentic record is one that can be proven to be what you say it is. To have been created and sent by the person claiming to have created or sent it, and to have been created or sent at the time that it was supposed to be. So do you trust the record? That's the key. This is a good example of this idea of trust. This is a digitized Civil War photograph, or it's a photograph of a group of Civil War reenactors that discovered the sepia tone filter on their camera. And how do we know that? We may not know, we may know what the difference is now, but 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, are we still going to know that? It's actually a group of Civil War reenactors, by the way. And if we opened up the properties of this digital image, we could see what camera it was taken with, the date that it was taken, the location it was taken. All of that information is embedded in the metadata of the digital file. Now, if we print that file out, we don't have that anymore. If we change the format at some point without capturing that internal metadata, we may not have that anymore. So these are kind of the issues that we have to deal with. If this was a paper photograph, you know, we could say this is a Civil War photograph and nobody would probably even bat an eye. So another aspect of authenticity is this one, and I'm going to remember if I had, okay, I don't. All right, so politician gives a speech. And as you can see, this is a screenshot of the Kentucky governor's website from back in the day when we started our website archive. And you can see you have next to each one of these speeches, the read is the text file, the listen is an audio file, and the watch is a video file. The official record, what the state considered to be the official record, was the text file that was handed out to the press, usually before the speech was given. If you've ever heard a politician give a speech, they may stray from the text. They go off on a tangent, they respond to questions, they don't even look at the teleprompter and kind of make up their own thing. So if you actually listen to the speech, if you were there, it may be very different than the text file that was given out. So which is the more authentic record? The official record may not actually be what was given at the time. So again, we can try to save all of these things. The video and the audio are kind of similar, although the video gives you more of the reaction. You can see the person's faces, you can see how they react to things. Yet the audio video file are far more problematic to maintain over time than the text file. But they may be a more authentic representation of what was done on that day. The other aspect of this is reliability. You know, do we have all of the record? Is it complete? And this comes from Governor Perry's files in Texas. Each one of these files is probably a 10 to 20 second audio clip that if you put them all together form a 2, 1, 2, 3 minute message. This is what you would listen to if you called the governor's office and were put on hold for example, he just makes like holiday announcements or, you know, what's going on in government at the time while you're on hold. But if you don't have this file down here at the bottom, which is a project file, the project file pulls all those things together. And if you open this with the audio software and you clicked on the project file, it would play the entire message seamlessly. So without that file, with that file, you can also output that message into a single audio file. But without that file, these are just random little audio clips. So again, making sure that you maintain all the pieces and parts of a file over time is important as well. And then finally, you have to be able to protect the file. When we talk about security or integrity, we usually talk about someone being able to go in and manipulate the file. That is one aspect of integrity. The other aspect is just making sure that file maintains over time. Anytime you touch electronic records, anytime you move them around, you're introducing the possibility of change. Transferring a record from one storage media to another, copying a file, for example, can cause hiccups in that file. If there's a hiccup in the network at the time, ones and zeros may get misplaced. If you've ever opened an image file and it has these lines in it, like the one on the right does, that means that something's happened to that file. The ones and zeros have been flipped. And this is an example of what we refer to as bit rot, which is digital media will decay over time. So if you have records stored on some type of digital media and you don't monitor them over time, this can happen. And it's just like paper deteriorating, ink fading, paper becoming brittle. This is what happens to electronic records over time. This is where something like a checksum would come in. A checksum is like a digital stamp that you can put on a file. And if you run that checksum later and something in that file has changed, that checksum won't work. And it doesn't tell you what has changed. It just tells you that something has changed. And then finally, records were created to be used. That is the big key here. The more access equals preservation. The more a file is accessed, the more you're going to keep it in a format that makes it accessible. And the way you do that is to understand what you need about your files. This is my children from years ago. As I said, they're 19 and 20 now. But all electronic records require some type of helper file, for example, an editor. PDF is probably the best example of that. If you open a PDF file, you have to have a PDF reader. Now, it used to be the Adobe Acrobat reader that they would give out for free. Now what Adobe has done is they have published the code for the reader software. So if you open a PDF file, say in Google Chrome or a web browser of almost any kind these days, it will open its own internal PDF reader. But you still have to have that reader to be able to manipulate that software in some way. Editors, viewers, if you wanted to edit a file, you needed the full version of Acrobat. So you need to know what those requirements are. And they change over time. I can remember back in the day when you had to have a TIFF viewer to view a TIFF image file. Now, most web browsers will open a TIFF file with no problem because that technology has been built into the software. The other aspect of usability is being able to find your files. This is my children in a leaf pile. Both of my kids are in this leaf pile. If you've ever done a Google search for something and you come up with 10 million hits, how many times or how many pages do you go through before you give up and either redo your search for something else, do something different? You need to be able to find your files. And that can be as simple as an index for your digital content management system. I hear people talk about data warehouses all the time, and I used to refer to data warehouse as a black hole because most data warehouses have very poor retrieval software. So you put your data in the data warehouse, how do you get it back out again? So you need to be able to find your files and in order to be able to use them. And just because I like showing this picture and knowing that everyone is spending all their time trying to find my son, he is right here. If you could see my cursor instead of listening to me. So how do we deal with all this stuff? It is all about the metadata, pure and simple. Metadata is information about the record, and it is literally data about data. And that metadata tells us about the record. It tells us what are the requirements for that record. It tells us what kind of record it is. It tells us what we need to do to be able to provide access if you know how to get into the properties of that data. Metadata can be embedded inside the record. Those are those properties of the digital file. If you can open up the file and see those properties. Metadata can be the record itself. If you have a title, a date, an author on, say, meeting minutes or an annual report or a publication. Metadata can be an external record to the system. This is an index or a finding aid of some kind. Metadata can even be the policies and procedures for how to access the system. It tells who has access to the system, what the security protocols are, etc. So that is probably the most important aspect of the record, but it's also probably the hardest part to manage and maintain over time. So as I said, access equals preservation. I will probably repeat that off and on throughout the presentation. The more a record is used, the more you're going to keep it in a usable format. We used to be really concerned about format obsolescence, formats coming and going, but the ubiquity of the internet these days has really kind of solved that problem to a certain extent, because we have digital images that are 20, 30 years old in Texas Archive that are still readable. You just have to make some effort to be able to kind of maintain all of that. You are going to be committed to migrating it forward through time as those things change. So, and this is pretty much the preservation challenge for electronic records, is that degree of change. It's not that the technology becomes less. It's actually the technology usually becomes better, but the older technology falls away. And if you think about this, this is kind of in paper, this is a longer lifespan, but in the electronic records, within that 0 to 5 year period, that's kind of when the records are live. You're using them all the time. You're keeping them in formats. You may upgrade from one version of Microsoft Office to another, but it's usually pretty manageable. All your records are done. In that 5 to 10 year period, that's when these records become less active. That's when you push them off to some type of alternative storage. Maybe put them on a disk and set them on a shelf. Maybe put them in a different storage server. Now you're going through multiple versions of your software. Do you go back and migrate all the stuff that's on that old storage when you do that? So now you're opening this record that's 5, 6, 7 years old. You're 3 versions ahead in the software from when it was created. Is that going to cause a problem? In that 5 to 10 year period, you're also probably talking about hardware migrations too. Most hardware in most business, whether it's government or private business settings, is upgraded every 5 to 7 years usually. New printers, new servers, new computers, and that introduces change as well. And then, of course, in that 10-year plus period, now you're looking at potentially having to migrate to completely new systems, completely new hardware, software, and all of that. So the preservation challenge is really change. It's the fact that paper records change slowly, electronic records change much quicker, and the fact that these things are machine readable. Paper records can exist in that state of what we refer to as benign neglect, which is this idea of those are the records that are sitting in a storage unit somewhere that haven't been touched. The attic, the basement, as long as water's not dripping on them, as long as something's not eating it or nesting in it, those records can exist indefinitely that way. It's not the best conditions, but you can still pick that record up. The paper may be brittle, the ink may have faded, but it's still there. With the electronic record, that becomes much harder. And we have kind of solved the media deterioration part. Magnetic media had a lifespan. If you remember back in the day, if you had a floppy disk and you put it in, it would ask to scan for bad sectors on the disk. That's where that magnetic field was starting to decay, and there were virtual holes in the disk. Optical media lasts, 50 to 100 years. Solid state media, we really don't know because it hasn't been around that long. However, people say all the time about, optical CDs, DVDs will last 50 to 100 years. And yet I look at this. How many of you right now have a computer that does not have a CD drive on it or a DVD drive? This is kind of anticlimactic because I can't see you all, but when I ask this in person, I like people raise their hands and stuff. But that's the thing. The laptop I'm giving this presentation on doesn't have a CD DVD drive. A tablet or a phone certainly doesn't. CDs are still perfectly viable, but drives are becoming not scarce, but they don't become standard anymore. Same thing with the other media that's pictured here. We have the capability of reading 3.5-inch drives. We can read 5.25-inch drives, but you still have to be able to read the media in order to be able to convert it to something else. The same thing with audio and videotape. We can digitize audio and video, but we still have to be able to play the tape in order to be able to access the media. Here's one that's even scarier. Is everybody is familiar with a flash drive. This is a USB-A flash drive. It's the USB-C flash drive. If you notice something different about them, it's they have different ports. I bought the laptop that I have now in 2020, right as the pandemic was starting. And the laptop I had before that had 5 of these drives on it. The laptop I have now has 2 because it has one of these and an HDMI drive. Or port. So again, if you have your records on removable media, but you can't access the media, you haven't saved the record. So you just need to be aware of these changes. Yes.
Hi, we have a question from
Yeah.
Julia. Is artificial intelligence and the possibility of altering images and recordings going to be addressed today?
Actually, I pulled out an image because I thought I had 30 or like 40 minutes, and then Chad told me I had 30. But not in great detail. I actually had an image of a screenshot of Times Square New Year's Eve from 1999. Where the CBS logo in the upper corner, if you were there live, was actually an NBC logo. CBS pixelated out the NBC logo during their live television broadcast. So if you were watching it on TV, you wouldn't constantly see NBC's logo in the upper right corner. That was 1999. So, but as far as deep fakes and stuff like that, no, I'm not really going to address those particularly because I don't have time. But we'll talk a little, this goes back to that idea of the metadata. And when they talk about being able to detect deep fakes and things like that, some of that is embedded in the metadata of the image, but you have to have access to the image in order to be able to see that. However, when you start changing formats, you lose some of that embedded metadata. So that becomes a bigger and bigger problem. So the best thing to do with images is you can watermark an image. You can apply a checksum to an image. So if somebody comes back to you and says, this is the image that you sent me and it's been changed, if you run that checksum again or compare it to the original, it won't work. It'll tell you that something has changed. The problem with checksums is they don't tell you what has changed. So unfortunately, that's, like I said, all I really have time for. So when records are at risk is when these things start to happen. Basically, when you're starting to change things. And I will also add, keep in mind that paper records can be forged. In some ways easier than electronic records, but we don't really pay attention to that because we're fixated on the electronic records. It all starts with records management. Identify what records you have, where are they located? How do you get control of those things? Look at the retention periods. I deal with digital preservation, so I deal with the archival records that we're going to keep forever, or as I start to say these days more and more until I retire, then it becomes my partner's problem. But get rid of the records that you can get rid of at the end of their natural life. So you're maintaining those records that you need to maintain over time. And then even policies and procedures, training and education, teaching people how to use systems and being able to do some of this digital forensics, as it were, to be able to identify these types of records. Figuring out what you want to preserve. I bring this up because the information and the look and feel in paper like this are fixed. I can't change the look and feel of this piece of paper. I can't alter the data that's on this piece of paper without changing the look and feel. In the electronic record, those are totally independent of each other. I can change the background, I can change the font, I can change retype information. And this is where things like checksums, this is where metadata becomes important, because if you send a record out of your control, you no longer have control of it. So somebody can alter a record and then come back and say, this is the official copy that you sent me. The best way to protect against that is to have systems in place to know when that record goes out, this is what it looked like on this day. And then if somebody tries to come back and bring it in, you could say, oh, this has been altered, and all that. I make it sound like that's easy. It's not. But again, that is way down a rabbit hole that I don't have time to deal with. But to talk about information versus appearance, especially when it comes to the idea of preservation, this is a Word document. This is the same document in what's called flat text or ASCII text, plain text. All of the information is here, but what you've lost is the formatting. If the formatting is important, then you need this document. If the formatting is not important, this is the easiest document to try to preserve over time. Almost any computer in the world can read that document because it's just in basic text. But like I said, if the look and feel is important when it comes to graphics, when it comes to color, when it comes to maps, that's not a good solution. So these are your preservation strategies, and this is what you need to be thinking about. Conversion to hard copy, paper or microfilm. I'm a big proponent of microfilm, and people say, but you're a digital archivist, and I'm like, yes, but microfilm will last forever. Well, hundreds of years under the right conditions if it's done properly. For text-based records, for black and white records, microfilm is still far superior when it comes to low access long-term preservation, because microfilm is eye readable. But what if you don't have a microfilm reader? All it takes is magnification and light. You could project microfilm up against a wall. Our people in Kentucky, we used to do microfilm for local agencies. When they would inspect microfilm, they used a light box and a magnifying glass to look at it. They didn't use a reader printer to do that. So if you're going to keep it, but those come with drawbacks. Low access. Microfilm, it sucks to use. Pardon my English. It does if you've never done it before. Paper takes up space, valuable space in a lot of cases. So those are the trade-offs. Electronic formats, you're looking at idea of sustainable formats, being able to migrate this through time, normalizing to specific formats, like converting Word documents to PDF. So that way you only have to maintain PDF documents, for example. And then the idea of lots of copies, keep stuff safe. This is kind of against the idea of records management, where you want to control copies. If you're going to preserve electronic copies, having multiple copies in multiple locations on multiple media is a good idea. And we'll kind of talk about that here in just a second. So as I said, the advantages to electronic records over paper is when it comes to access. You could store millions of files on a computer, but it's really all about the access. You can, through the internet, records can be accessible 24/7, 365. You don't have to have staff there to do that. You can search and retrieve. If you've ever tried to search paper records, it's hard. You could do full text searching of electronic records. You could do electronic indexing. There's just better ways of dealing with that. The disadvantages are the fact that they are hardware and software dependent. So you have to have the technology to be able to access the records. This idea of access and security, if you put records out there on the internet, people can come to it, and once they download a copy of that record, they can do all kinds of things to it. People used to like PDF because PDF was non-editable, and I used to laugh at people and say PDF is 100% editable if you have the right software. So it's hard, but it's possible. So you just have to have security protocols in place to be able to deal with that. And then you got the costs as well, maintenance, IT costs, and all of that. This is just a quick example, and I'm not sure exactly how much time I have, but this is the Doomsday Book. When William the Conqueror conquered England in 1066, he took a census of what he conquered. It's considered the first modern census. It basically was an inventory of the lands and goods that he now owned. It's written on vellum. which is sheepskin. It's parchment. This book has gone through fire, flood. It's been held for ransom. It's been kicked around. Now you can't access the actual book without having like the proper credentials, but the paper vellum is technically not paper, but paper copy still exists. In the early 2000s, the British government tried to digitize the Doomsday Book because they were wanting to marry that data with modern GIS data. And over time, it was a multi-year project. So in the 10 years it took them to digitize this book, the CD on the left is what they used. There were only 5 readers left in the England because this was a technology that flopped. So they had to spend another 5-10 years getting that information off of that obsolete media into something else. Yes, I have another question.
Yes. Does PDFA still have a place in long-term records management?
Yes, and I will address that here in just a second. So long-term preservation strategies, like I said, convert to hard copy if you feel the need to. It has its place. It doesn't, you can't convert a database to paper, for example. You can't do audio and video in that sense, but for text-based records, this is an easy way for long-term records that you have to keep with little or no access of being able to not have to deal with all that stuff. To keep records in electronic format, you need these kind of sustainable formats is what we're talking about. And they're formats that aren't expected to change slowly over time. The internet has really kind of fixed this problem. 10, 15, 20 years ago, we were all worried about obsolete formats. You put it in a format, you may not be able to get it out again. Because of putting records online and having things in the cloud and so forth, you don't know what software the people are using to access that record. A lot of software these days is forward and backwards compatible. PDFA was an attempt to basically what Adobe said was they froze the standard for PDF. I think at version 1.4, but they may have upgraded that over the years. And basically what they said is if you adhere to these standards, we will make sure that the reader software is always available. And the way they did that is they put the reader software out into the public domain. So PDFA is an international standard. PDF is now an international standard, and newer versions of Acrobat will read older versions of Acrobat. So while PDFA is a very viable long-term preservation, it is a sustainable format. So is regular PDF these days. Adobe used to be, in the early days of PDF 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, they were one of the ones that was kind of bad about taking features out of the software when they would update it, which made newer versions of the software more difficult to read older versions. And they've really kind of stopped doing that. Now, Microsoft Office was another one that was really bad about every time you move from Microsoft Word version 1 to version 2, you basically had to start all over again. Since Windows 95, Microsoft Office files now can read themselves back to 95 with relatively little effort. Microsoft Word can read old Microsoft Word files. One of the problems is it wants you to upgrade it to the newer version of Microsoft Word, which can cause formatting issues, but it can still open and read those files. So yes, PDFA is still perfectly viable. It just basically what Adobe said is don't do weird things to the PDF file, because you can create a PDF file from scratch using Acrobat and add a lot more features than what most people do, which is take a Word file and convert it to PDF. That's relatively simple. But there's a lot of things that you can add to a PDF file if you use Acrobat natively. So whenever you change formats, it does, again, cause change. So again, this is a Word document. This is the Word document with track changes turned on. And so as you can see, this document's been edited. The fact that there's multiple colors means it's been edited by multiple people. You also have the comments in there. If you convert this document to PDF, you either A, may lose the track changes if that's important, or the PDF file may activate the track changes and display them. So both of those can be problematic. In the government setting, the document with the changes could be considered a draft, which may make it restricted to public access, because what is accessible is the final version. If you're in a university archive and you're getting the archive of a writer or an author, you want the track changes because that shows you the evolution of the document. So both of those are important. You may not even know the track changes exist if you just get the Word file or if you just get the PDF file. So again, being able to test these things, know what the system does or doesn't do is important. I mentioned this earlier, lots of copies keep stuff safe. This is a preservation mantra, not a records management mantra. But you want to have multiple copies in multiple formats in multiple locations. So if you have copies in the cloud, we have copies, our digital preservation system is in the cloud. We have local copies on local servers that we keep. If something happens to the cloud copy, we can go back to the server and recreate all of that data. I know the city of Dallas or Dallas County, I can't remember, just recently recovered from a ransomware attack a couple of years ago. And they went to great lengths to having to reconstruct all of the data and all that because they got locked out of their systems. If you have alternate copies in other locations, that helps. This is separate from disaster backups that your IT people want. This is just an alternate copy somewhere else. Now you have to balance that with the cost is the issue. Because more copies mean you're paying more for storage, and different size copies, different copies in different resolutions can be big, small, whatever. So you have to weigh the cost effectiveness with that. You have to weigh the accessibility as well. What does it take to make your records accessible? And what functionality do you have to have? Do you have to replicate all the functionality over time? Or can you make that interactive web page a little bit more static so you can take a screenshot and that's what you save over time? And then this sounds kind of counterintuitive, but especially for government, it's easier because we tend to do things as cheaply as possible. You don't necessarily want to be on the cutting edge of preservation strategies because preservation strategies come and go. You want something that's been proven to work and has been proven to be reliable and resilient. So it's good to kind of stay a version or two behind because you don't want to be the experimental one. You want to be the one that's more on the cost-effective one. And then evaluate all the resources. People tend not to look at, our governments tend to look at cost more than other places because again, we want to do things cheaply. But and this is where I come back to, it depends. Do you have in-house storage versus online or cloud storage? Cloud storage may be cheaper, but again, it comes with other risks. In-house storage is more expensive, but then you have direct control over it. Thinking about volume, when you're talking about archives or digital preservation, you're not getting rid of records. I know a lot of people say when they talk about records management, you can have a small storage room, and as long as you apply records management, destroy records when the time comes, bring in records as they come in, you can take a small space and manage that over time. With a digital archive repository, you're not getting rid of anything. So it's always growing. That's something to be aware of. And you may need multiple copies because there are copies that are good for preservation and there are copies that are good for access. A lot of times they're similar, but sometimes they may be different. So photographs are one where you may keep a high resolution master as your preservation copy, but you want a low resolution JPEG file that you're going to put on your website because the high resolution file would be too hard to download, take too much time, all of that. That's a way to guard against people stealing your photographs sometimes. Put low resolution photographs out there or watermarked photographs. But if somebody requests an official copy, then you can give them the high resolution unwatermarked copy. We watermark all of our photographs we put in our digital archives, for example. Do you have in-house support IT support, or are you going to rely on a vendor? Then you need to talk about the contract. Who's responsible for what? What kind of staff resources do you have? Years ago, we looked at archiving GIS files. No one in the archives knew how to handle a GIS file. We didn't have the expertise to be able to do that. So we had to partner with the GIS office to be able to understand how these files work and how they could be used. Volume is another one. When we got video from the governor's office, these were the final official versions, which meant that they were edited, they were cut down, they were the ones that were packaged to be able to be pushed out to the public. These were the raw unedited files where they basically followed him around with a video camera for 2, 3, 4 hours a day, and then they've kind of cut that up for the official version. So the unedited version is has more detail, but it's also bigger. And then you have things like what was uploaded to the internet, because flash files are really poorly, they're low resolution kind of files made to be shared. So they're not good for long-term preservation, but they're really good for access. So, but it also shows you what parts of the files were actually used by the governor's office, as opposed to all the images that they took that never saw the light of day. I think most of us are probably familiar with compression because digital media files are so large. You can compress them and shrink them down. From a preservation standpoint, you want the uncompressed raw file. However, that's also the biggest and hardest file to store. So then when you think about compression, lossless compression is better because it can be done more than once. Lossy compression, the computer basically just looks at the image and takes out all the little bits that your eye can't see, and then you can't resize it again. That's the problem. However, if you use certain software or hardware, like if you video record your meeting minutes, the video recording software may automatically compress the files just because it has its own built-in storage and it tries to keep those things safe. That doesn't mean the files are bad. That just means that they have different preservation issues that you have to think about. The cloud, I'm kind of speeding up here because I'm also probably eating into Chad's time. The cloud is essentially just someone else's computer. Everybody's worried about what's out there in the cloud. The cloud is just another computer someone else manages. So if you use Google Cloud, Google's in charge of it, not you. So if you're going to contract for cloud services, you just need to know what the contract states, who's responsible for what. In the state, they tend to not like cloud services on one hand because the state's not in charge. On the other hand, our in-house IT people push us into the cloud because then they don't have to manage and maintain the software. So again, it's all about the contact and it's all about the relationship that you have with your IT folks. And you do need to have some relationship with your IT folks, whether it's in-house or a vendor, because they're the ones that manage and maintain the technology. Just keep aware that they manage and maintain the system. They don't necessarily deal with the records inside the system. Their job is to make sure the system works and is secure. So, yes.
Any tips on how small localities with no to minimal IT staff manage this?
Again, that is where cloud computing can help. But as I said, you just need to engage possibly your legal staff just to make sure everything is spelled out in the contract. Who is responsible for maintenance? Who's responsible for upgrades? If the system goes down, how long, what kind of response time do they have? That's all part of actually the contract to deal with that. How good is the customer service? It's as simple as that. It's kind of making sure that you know what's happening. If you have a company hosting your website and your website goes down, people can't interact with you. So that's a critical need that you need to have to get back up and running as quickly as possible. And again, a lot of that's spelled out in the contract that you have. So there are benefits to cloud services, and I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying that, you have to be aware of that. I love it when people criticize Facebook, for example, for changing their Facebook pages. It looks different. I can't deal with this. How come it does this? And I ask people, who are Facebook's customers? You are not Facebook's customers. The Facebook's customers are the advertisers that are buying the data that you provide Facebook. So that's a slightly different example, but if you think about Gmail, if you have a Gmail account as a personal individual, you're not paying for that. If something happens to your Gmail account and you can't recover your messages, Google will make an effort to try to recover that data. Ultimately, they'll just give you a new Gmail account and you can start all over again. If you're using Gmail on the business side, like a lot of local governments I know have started doing, you have a contract with them at that point. You are a paying customer at that point. Therefore, they have a greater responsibility to be able to back up, maintain, and all of that. So that's all really kind of part of the contract and the terms of service with these things. When you're talking with IT people, it's good to be on the same page. If you ask IT people, like for example, does your system archive data? They will tell you yes, because archive in the IT world means to take from this storage media and put it on this storage media, largely to save space. It has nothing to do with long-term retention. So just make sure you're talking about the same thing. If you don't know what this movie reference is, go out and watch Princess Bride now. Everyone should have to do that once in their life. So the best advice here is to figure out what you can do and work on it, exploit your strengths. If you're really good at keeping images, keep images. If you're really good at keeping PDF documents, keep PDF documents. I mean, you don't have to necessarily do everything, but do what you can. Don't forget about like paper backups, microfilm backups. I know the Library of Virginia, I'm pretty sure, probably still has the capability to go from paper to digital, digital to paper. That's our paper to microfilm, or digital to microfilm, microfilm to digital. That works too. So we can do that at Texas. Kentucky could do that. We could scan material and produce microfilm from the scans. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you do something. You look for practical solutions. There's a lot of really cool digital preservation toys out there, but you probably don't need that. A good checksum checker to protect the integrity of the files, some good editors and text readers and things like that. And you could probably build a small archive on your own. You don't need to look at brand new, really cool things. Yes.
Yes, one of our participants may have missed this and they mentioned that. What cloud services provide this service to manage this? Is there a checklist that they would need to use when evaluating a service?
This is something that the state archives or the local government section of the state archives can provide you with. Some of that's going to depend on what the requirements are for your state. From a preservation standpoint, I'm not trying to promote any specific company. There are really only a handful of companies that do that. In Texas, we use a company called Preservica. They're probably the leaders in this field for a digital preservation repository. There are lots of content management systems out there that are probably used on a more records management oriented level that your local government services can provide. The other major long-term preservation repository is another one called LibNova, but they are kind of a newer player to the field. But there are other ways to apply preservation principles to your repository without necessarily having to have an end-to-end solution to that. So again, sorry, but for the sake of time, the answer is it depends. And then this is where engaging other stakeholders goes into play. Look at what other governments are doing. Rely on the state archives because they can help you. They can push you in the right direction. National Association of Government Records and Administrators, whatever NAGARA stands for, is they're kind of the professional association for government records managers and administrators. They can provide at least direction in those types of things. Record keeping management systems are really good for managing records in the short term. They can manage records in the long term, but then you need to add some more long-term preservation aspects of those things. But if you have records management control, that you're like halfway down the path to long-term preservation at that point. And doing something is better than doing nothing. A lot of places, I even see state archives that still do this. They're afraid to start because they don't want to mess up. You know you're going to mess up. That's going to happen. This is why you have multiple copies of your long-term preservation material, is because something might happen, and some things out of your control might happen. So it's always the cool thing about electronic records is you can make copies, and you can have, again, one copy that's live, active, that's full, that the public has access to. You can have a third copy that's on a static server somewhere, like on a computer or a server in your building that maintains like an alternate copy. You can have a third copy that's compressed using lossless compression, so it shrinks the file size down and allows you to store more data on the same type of space. That is more of an offline copy. You just have to be aware that periodically you have to check that offline copy to make sure that it's still good, and all that, and those things work in tandem. So with that, I am done. This is Chad and I from one of our state archives meetings from long ago. He is the brother from another mother that I have. So I will kind of turn things over to him now. And
Just giving you the whole time, man. I really appreciate this. This has been great information. And I will remember to email you for the slides.
yes.
Really, well, first let me pause and say, does anybody else have any other questions for Mark before I get started with my spiel? Really appreciate you taking your time today, my friend.
And I know this is one of those I bring up, or I cause people to think of more questions than I answer, but this is why I could spend days talking about probably any one of those slides, so in more detail. So, but thank you.
I know exactly what you mean. All right, folks, I'm going to skip over and I will start sharing my screen then. Really, all I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about Virginia's electronic records guidelines that we just adopted, updated, long overdue last fall. And one thing I want to do when I'm talking about this is I want to pause for a second and acknowledge that a lot of the work on this document, the electronic records guidelines, was done by two analysts that have moved on, Dolores Bailey and Katie Ray. I want to give them credit for a lot of work they did on this. Thank you, ladies, very much. And so the idea about the electronic record guidelines is, it's kind of like Mark's saying, it's hard to give very specifically applicable advice to any two agencies, much less the entire state. So the thought about this was to give some very general guidelines and pointers in terms of what to think about when you're thinking about electronic records. A lot of these things grow out of a document that was put out by the State Archives of Minnesota, I think in like 1999 or 2000. It was called Trustworthy Electronic Records. And most of us who were in the profession back then read that, and it was kind of a Bible for us. It was also something like 120, 140 pages. The version of it that's out there right now, it's like 150 pages. And most people, when they have a quick question, they don't want to get buried in a 150-page document. They just want like a couple of like bullet points that they can use and move forward. So the idea for the electronic record guidelines was to break them down into topics to make it a little easier for people to quickly get at. I'm interested in this topic. I don't want to read the whole document. I just want to get right here and talk about social media records. I want to talk about email or what have you. And so it was made to be broken into chunks that could be more easily digestible, and hopefully nothing there would be too intimidating. So to get into the first part of it, my bar here is covering my my screen, so I can't really see to get around.
You can put your mouse on the bar and move it.
Yeah, I just got it moved there. All right, so we're talking about I want to get into the trustworthy electronic record section here. And Mark talked about a lot of the function of this already. But the characteristics of a record are, its content. What information does that record convey? What's the function of government that it documents? And then there's a context to it. Additionally to what the record says, the context is who created it. Why was it created? When was it created? Who was its intended audience? And is there a relationship between that record and other records that document a given function of government? And then finally, there's a structure to it. Does the structure matter? Does the way something is laid out tell us something about why it was created, who it was aimed to? Does it communicate something else about the originating agency? And then we get into issues of reliability, authenticity, integrity, and usability. Mark talked about these in some detail, so I don't want to go into a lot of detail about it. But generally speaking, what I wanted to highlight was the strength of looking at your electronic records to the extent that you can with the end in mind. That being at the end of that record's lifespan, what's its final disposition going to be? Is it going to be something that is going to be preserved permanently? Is it going to be something that's going to be destroyed confidentially? Is it going to be something that's destroyed non-confidentially? And with that end in mind, what can you do now to make achieving that end goal more easily done? You know, can you arrange the records in such a way that you can find the records that need to be destroyed and pull them out? Can you store them in formats that are more readily used for long-term preservation? Can you store them in formats that can take advantage of internal file structures that will categorize them, or can even apply records management software functions within the record itself, within the software system you're using to read the record? To what extent is that possible? And again, it's not so much that we have a whole lot of questions, a whole lot of answers, as it is that we're trying to provide you with questions to ask when you're looking at what your electronic systems do, to try to help you reach those end goals as easily as possible. Gosh, with all that, I don't think I want to get too much into all of that today. I just want to make everybody aware that the guidelines are out there. We plan to do some more deep dives into each individual section of the electronic records guidelines in the future, either on video or via a live town hall kind of thing like this. But today was just really about introducing the electronic records guidelines and talking very generally about electronic records concerns, and of course, leaning on Mark's expertise. With that, I want to make sure we have some time at the end of the town hall today to open the floor for questions. So I don't want to take up a whole lot more time. I would rather just throw the floor open and we see what people have to ask.
While we're waiting for that, I've been trying to kind of go through the comment section and answer things more specifically. To get back to the PDFA question, PDFA was a package that was kind of put together years ago as a way of creating a long-term format. And there's nothing wrong with PDFA. One of the big keys of the PDFA specification was that the record had to be self-contained. It didn't rely on outside influences. One of the biggest outside influences is fonts. And this is kind of odd because you're like, who cares about what the font is? But a lot of times, especially if you convert from Word to PDF, there may be fonts available in the Word document that aren't available in the PDF, which means that the PDF file has to go point to the Word file. If it can't, or point to the location of those fonts, if you can't get to that, it can't render those things. It goes for bigger things. For PDFA, you can't use electronic signatures as well. You can, but that's kind of weird because again, it relies on something outside of the document. However, PDF also got the PDF format made an international standard, so that works too. So yes, there was a question.
Okay, and I did put a question in the chat.
Let's see.
Basically, does anyone know how to use an Adobe portfolio file and convert it for use in Teams? And that's a unique situation for
that is a good question, and you're going to have kind of local and a local answer. Adobe portfolio files are not PDFA compliant, but they can be problematic, yes, and
That is
that
not
is an issue. But yeah, you're going to have somebody kind of more local to your situation to give you more specific details than I can. So
okay. Well, let me flip that question a little bit. So in terms of using Teams to store our files and retrieve our files, because they're used on a consistent basis with licensing programs for our VDSS agency. Are there any techniques that you would recommend, knowing that we're using Teams?
well, it's probably a little bit more complicated than that, because hopefully your Teams is built on SharePoint, because Teams by itself is not necessarily a repository. It's kind of like storing files in your email system. It's not really designed for that. So most Teams implementations are usually built on SharePoint, which is Microsoft's kind of content management system. The key to that is to have the right policies and protocols in for how to manage those records over time. Retention periods, who has access to what folders, making sure folders people move things to the right folder, because if they're just stored in the Teams application, they're very fragile. People can delete things. That's it's very much like attachments to email. If the attachment is the record, it needs to be stored in a more formal system than just leaving it in the email, because it may be harder to do that. It's kind of like the answer to the portfolio question. It's going to be kind of how your IT system is set up, as to what that backend repository will be, and all of that.
Okay. And for a fix, we are transitioning to SharePoint. It's being set up, but in the meantime, we're using Teams. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure how long before the SharePoint site will be set up, but
Okay.
and then I know I had to drop off, but I saw the earlier part where you spoke about the drives, the external drives that have a different port. So we are experiencing that as well. And for those that have the external drives, is there a way that we can share that data from the external drive? What do you recommend for just the purging of the data? Are we just destroying the external drive, or how do you discard it as well? Because I thought I saw something in the documentation, but I can't really recall.
Destruction is going to kind of depend on the content of the record, because if it's confidential and it has to be totally destroyed, I'm sure the Virginia folks have guidelines for that. In some cases, if everything on the drive is going to be disposed of, then yeah, you can wipe the drive. I always loved giving destruction presentations, because I can make people afraid of their computer. Just deleting something on your computer doesn't actually delete it. It basically tells the computer you don't want it anymore, and the computer forgets that it's there. And if it needs the space, it'll take it. If it doesn't need the space, it may never take it. So for external drives, it's a little bit more. If you delete something off an external drive, it usually goes ahead and deletes it off the drive. But even then, if you have, like say, a portable hard drive, it has a recycle bin, just like, it's just hidden. So there is software that you can go through that'll overwrite the drive. Like, it actually fills it with ones and zeros that are just kind of nonsense to make sure it's deleted. If push comes to shove, you can physically dispose of the drive itself. Like actually physically damage the drive in some way. Same thing with CDs or DVDs, for example. You can break the disc or something like that. But again, that's going to depend on the level of destruction that you need.
Okay. Well, thank you
All right.
very much. We learned with Adobe Portfolio the hard way.
So,
We're gonna take a question from Katie. She's
Right,
just unmuted herself.
Yes, I have a question. We have used paper records for a long time, and I think staff are pretty comfortable with um, that process of sending them to the record center and knowing that they will be destroyed according to the disposition schedule. But as we're moving to more electronic records, I guess those don't get transferred to the record center, and so then it's sort of on us to then destroy them in the time according to the disposition schedule. And I think there's a lot of sort of like I don't want to destroy that spreadsheet, or I don't want to, remove that tab or get rid of that file, because what if I need it later? And so I don't feel like I think people have sort of just trusted that it goes off to the record center, and if they need it, it's fine. But it seems harder to want to get rid of that when it's just a little file on your desktop and it doesn't seem to hurt anybody to keep it there.
That's been, it's been a feature or a bug or however you want to call it of electronic records pretty much the entire time they've been around. Because if you had an office that was completely full of paper, you'd know you have a problem. But your hard drive can be 98% full and there's no visual cues to say, oh man, I have a problem or something like that. It's still the code still says that you destroy records at the end of their retention period. And that applies whether the records are electronic or whether they're physical. It is always easier just to say, well, I'm not going to delete that electronic file because it's not really causing me any pain to hold on to it. But the code still says you should be destroying it. And in point of fact, what I always tell people is everything that you have that you don't need is something that's going to be something, even if it's not requested in a FOIA request or a subpoena or discovery or something like that, it's something else that you have to go through to get to the thing that is requested. So it's best practice, not only the law, but best practice to get rid of the things that you aren't required to keep. And the whole time I've been doing records management, the vast majority of people keep things vastly longer than they need to. I've been doing this 20 years. This is my third state. It's the same thing everywhere. And it comes down to some version of the statement. If I get rid of that thing today, tomorrow my boss is going to ask me for it and I'm going to get in trouble for not having it. And what I have found is when I tell people they could have gotten rid of something 5 years ago, I'm their best friend. I have never made somebody happy by saying, oh, you have to hold on to that thing for 5 more years. But if they call me up and I say, you could have gotten rid of that thing 2 years ago, they love me. They're going to name their kids after me. I'm their best friend. They're going to call me once a week. People want to do the right thing and they will get rid of records that they don't need if they know it's the right thing to do. And if they have somebody that will back them up. And that's what I'm here for. I'm here to tell you, yes, it's okay to destroy this thing. And if anybody comes back and they're mad at you, I can tell them, look, that person followed the retention schedule. It said to get rid of those records after 3 years. It doesn't matter whether they're in a database or if they're at the state record center. 3 years is 3 years. The record is the record. And if that person followed the retention schedule, then they did the right thing. And if they have a problem with the schedule, then that's for me to address, not for them. So if you ever need any backup in, how you treat things, particularly when it comes to digital versus hard copy records, please lean on us here at the library. And I did want to bring this up when I was talking earlier, but then I was kind of like cutting things short. I'm going to share my screen again very quickly because I want to highlight the Public Records Act. Oops, there we go. All right, the Public Records Act. This section right here, 42.1-86.01. If you ever have a question, can I keep this thing electronically? This says the answer is yes. Regardless of any other statute that was adopted. This was adopted in 2018 and overrides anything prior. Whatever records you have, they can be kept in electronic format. As long as you can make sure that things accessible for the entire length of its retention period. So for things longer than about 25 years, you're going to be looking at translating formats. I mean, because I'm here at my desk, I can do this. You can't read this, but this says Chad's master's thesis, Word 97. So I haven't had a 3.5-inch floppy drive on a computer at work since probably like 2007. Word 97, I think, is like 15 versions of Word ago. If I was going to get into that file today, I'd be out of luck. I can access that file because I've translated it from different versions of Word over the years, and I've migrated it to different storage media. For long-term preservation, that's what you're going to end up wanting to do. You're going to want to make sure you can translate that file from one file format to another, one storage media to another over its lifetime, so you can make sure you can access it. But can you keep any record in electronic format? The answer is yes. That's the bottom line is yes.
Just to kind of add to that a little bit, if you find that you need that record more often, like after you transfer it to the record center or the archives, then you need to contact Chad or whoever and increase that retention period. Because those are usually based on kind of common examples. But in your case, if it's, if you keep finding after the 2, 3, 4 year period, you keep needing to get back to it, then it just means you need to increase the retention period. But imaging records is the same as back in the day when we were going from paper to microfilm. You just have to make sure it's an authentic copy of the record. That it captures the same information. It's done the same way. It's been around long enough now. The whole key to the trustworthy systems thing that Chad was talking about from Minnesota was back in the day, the records management was all about how opposing counsel is going to tear apart your electronic record keeping system because it wasn't that good. Whereas today, most imaging systems are very similar to the microfilm systems that we had back in the 90s. And most places recognize that. So,
yeah, Tashana, did we have another question coming in?
We do. Is there a Central Virginia repository that localities can use for storing data?
Not to my knowledge. And I don't think that's on the immediate horizon. There's not even a central repository for state government, let's put it that way, much less for all localities. And it would be difficult to wrangle something that would be able to take all the possible permutations of records that would come in. I don't think that's on the radar right now. It may be down the line, but as of right now, there is no generally available repository.
I know that even in Texas, we have our Texas Digital Archive. We don't take local records either. And a part of that is volume. It's just we have a hard enough time managing and maintaining state records. I do know that there are some states that are kind of looking into that. Kansas has flirted with it before. I think Oregon has talked about doing it. It is something that's possible, but like I said, it's usually kind of a volume record. We don't take paper records into the state archives either, so or from localities. So unless there's an extraordinary situation. And just to show off from what Chad did earlier, there's your 5 1/4 inch disc. There's your 8 inch disc. I have an entire cubic foot box of these at the archives in Texas that are unreadable because while I have an 8 inch disk drive, it doesn't work. So yeah.
Hey, Chad, were you able to see the last message from Ms. Burrell?
Yes, I was just about to answer.
Perfect.
I was typing it in the window, but I'll go ahead and answer it out here. It says, what if a business unit has 20-year-old data in its main system application? How's it handled? Should it be saved in electronic format or in the cloud? It's another it depends answer. It depends on what the data is you're looking at. Does it have a permanent retention? If it's in electronic format already, then yes, just maintaining it in electronic format is going to be fine. If it's in hard copy, do you want to convert it to an electronic format? Not necessarily, unless you need more ready access to it. But yeah, it is kind of another it depends kind of question. We can talk to you one-on-one about what it is you have later if you'd like.
And as we've talked about the different types of discs and different types of removable media, I answered this, I think, in the chat earlier when we were talking about CDs. You can still buy external CD drives, of course. You can still get desktop computers that have CDs, CD drive built in. It's just that, and you can still buy 3.5 inch floppy drives from Amazon that have a USB adapter. It's just for like 5 1/4 inch drives, those are getting harder to find. You also have to have a special controller because most modern computers don't have the internal hardware to be able to read a 5 1/4 inch floppy drive. You can hook the drive up to your computer if you have the correct cables, but it can't actually read the drive because that functionality has been taken out. So you just want to get stuff off of, and I'm not saying CDs are going away tomorrow, but in 10, 15 years, a CD is going to be a lot like a 3.5 inch disc is now. It's possible. It just gets harder to do. And you know, that's the same with AV material too, sadly, is videotape, audio tape. Is think about how hard it is to buy a videotape recorder or an audio tape recorder, because you could digitize those things as long as you can access them. So, and there are private vendors that will do that, that are built on that. So yes, definitely.
All right, folks, we are reaching the end of our time. Just want to honor the time by folks who are just hanging on until the last minute and say thank you for being here. Again, there will be slides going out, a link to that, as well as we trust the recording has gone well. And there will be a link to that coming also that will be posted on Vayroll.
And
So-
I want to thank Mark for his time. I also want to thank my colleagues Glenn, Tashona, and Emily for helping co-host. And thank all of you for the enthusiasm. This has been fantastic.